You make more money than your parents did. So does your neighbor. One of you is doing better than either of your parents ever did. The other is falling behind faster than they've realized. And for years, you both assumed you were in roughly the same boat, same neighborhood, similar jobs, similar starting points 20 years ago. You weren't. And the gap between you says something bigger about what's actually happening to the middle class. Something stranger and more honest than the story you usually hear. Here's the thesis, up front, because it deserves to be stated plainly instead of buried under statistics. The middle class isn't simply shrinking, it's splitting. Some of it is drifting upward into real prosperity. Some of it is drifting downward into real precarity. And the space in between, the broad, secure middle that used to hold most of a society together, is what's actually disappearing. Let's make this concrete with two families, because abstractions don't explain why this feels the way it feels. 20 years ago, the Whitmans and the Alvarezes lived 4 houses apart. Similar incomes, similar jobs, one in mid-level management, one in skilled trades. Similar assumptions about what their lives would look like at 50. The Whitmans bought their home in 2005, just before their local market took off. Steady employer retirement contributions compounded quietly for 2 decades. Their industry stayed stable. Nothing dramatic happened to them. They just made a few ordinary decisions at exactly the right moments, and time did the rest. The Alvarezes rented through the same period, waiting for a better time to buy that kept receding as prices climbed faster than their savings. A layoff in 2011 ate through what savings they had. Their industry saw wage stagnation while automation quietly reduced overtime opportunities. They did nothing wrong. They just made ordinary decisions in a market that didn't reward them the same way. Today, the Whitmans are quietly upper middle class, the kind of comfortable that doesn't feel like luck from the inside because none of the individual decisions felt remarkable at the time. The Alvarezes are quietly sliding toward the edge of the lower income tier, the kind of struggle that doesn't feel like failure from the inside for the same reason. Neither family would describe themselves as the subject of an economic trend, but they are, and the data behind their split is larger than either of them realizes. In 1970, middle-income households in America accounted for 62% of the country's total income. By 2020, that number had fallen to 42%. The share of Americans who count as middle class by income has shrunk, too, from around 61% in 1971 to about 51% today. Here's the part most explainers skip, and it matters. Some of that shrinking middle didn't fall downward like the Alvarezes. A significant portion moved upward like the Whitmans. The share of U.S. households earning at least $100,000 a year, adjusted for inflation, rose from about 13% in 1967 to over 37% by 2022. In 2025 alone, the U.S. added roughly 440,000 new millionaires, more than 1,000 a day. So which family is the real story? The Whitmans or the Alvarezes? Both. That's the uncomfortable answer, and it's the one this video is actually about. Housing is where the split shows up first and most brutally. Nationally, income has risen a modest amount over recent decades. In many metro areas, home prices have risen 2 to 4 times faster than local wages. The share of first-time homebuyers has fallen to around 21% of the market, down from 44% in 1981. The median age of a first-time buyer has climbed to 40, up from 29 4 decades ago. For the Whitmans, that timing worked in their favor. They bought before the acceleration. For the Alvarezes, it worked against them. They're still renting into their 40s, watching a milestone their parents reached in their 20s stay permanently out of reach. Healthcare costs have outpaced wage growth for decades. Childcare in many regions now costs more annually than in-state college tuition. Higher education, once a reliable ladder into the middle class, now often requires debt that follows people into their 40s.
More than half of young adults between 18 and 24 now live with their parents, not from lack of ambition, but from math that simply didn't exist for the generation before them. None of this is evenly distributed. It's exactly this unevenness, this split, that's reshaping what middle class even means. There's a curious wrinkle in how people perceive all of this. Between 2019 and 2025, the share of Americans describing the national economy as good or excellent fell by roughly 24 percentage points. But the share describing their own personal finances as okay or comfortable barely moved, falling by only about 2 percentage points. Most people's read on their own household held up far better than their read on the country's trajectory. That gap matters. Some of what feels like erasure isn't really about individual households collapsing. It's about the disappearance of a shared reference point. When the broad middle used to represent most of a society's common experience, its splitting apart, even partly upward, changes the texture of everyday life. Fewer neighbors at your exact income level, a wider, more visible gap between the Whitmans 4 houses down and the Alvarezes next door, even though nobody moved. This split isn't uniform. In some regions, a given income still stretches close to what it did a generation ago. In major coastal metro areas, the same income barely covers rent. Generationally, the picture splits the same way. Older Americans who bought homes decades ago have, on average, benefited from decades of compounding equity most younger adults haven't had time to build. Younger adults today sit disproportionately in the lower income tier compared to older generations at the same life stage, partly because wealth simply takes time to build, and partly because the climb itself is steeper than it used to be. It's worth taking the optimistic argument seriously in its strongest form, without letting it dominate the story. Some economists argue that fixed percentile definitions of middle class are misleading. Under a fixed real dollar definition, the share of low-income households has fallen substantially since the 1960s, and the share of high-income households has grown substantially. By that measure, this looks less like decline and more like broad upward mobility. That's genuinely true. It's also true that the specific costs tied to what used to define middle-class security, a home, health care without financial catastrophe, education without long-term debt, have risen faster than income for a meaningful share of people, especially younger workers in high-cost regions. A 6-figure income doesn't feel like abundance if a starter home in your area now costs 8 or 9 times that, instead of 3 or 4 times it, the way it often did a few decades ago. Both things are true. The Whitmans are living proof of one. The Alvarezes are living proof of the other. Neither of them is wrong about their own experience. So where does this leave you, whichever house you happen to be standing in? Probably somewhere in the uncomfortable space between both family stories. The middle class your parents knew wasn't just an income bracket. It was a shared set of assumptions about what a home should cost relative to income, about what one stable job could guarantee, about how far a paycheck could reasonably stretch. Those assumptions still hold in some places for some people, and quietly stopped holding for a lot of others, not because of one decision, but because of which decade you happen to make your biggest financial choices in. The Whitmans still wave to the Alvarezes when they pass on the street, same neighborhood, same starting point 20 years ago. Neither family fully realizes how far apart the ground beneath them has actually shifted. That gap, quiet, uneven, mostly invisible from the outside, might be the real story of the middle class right now. Not one villain, not one clean narrative, just 2 families, 4 houses apart, living out 2 different answers to the same question, and neither of them entirely sure which answer they actually got.
So what actually separated the Whitman path from the Alvarez path? Not talent, not effort. A handful of concrete decisions made at specific moments that most people don't realize are decision points until years later. Timing on housing mattered more than almost anything else. not because the Whitmans were smarter, but because they bought before their local market accelerated, and time did the compounding for them. If you're renting and waiting for the right moment, the data suggests the cost of waiting has, for many markets, outpaced the cost of buying imperfectly and adjusting later. Retirement contributions mattered the same way. The Whitmans' employer contributions sat untouched for 2 decades. 2 decades of compounding, even on modest amounts, is difficult to replicate later at any contribution size. The single biggest lever isn't how much you save in your best year, it's how many years you give it to grow, uninterrupted. And debt timing mattered. The Alvarez's setback wasn't the layoff itself. Layoffs happened to both paths. It was having no buffer when it happened. The families who drift upward tend to share one unglamorous trait: 3 to 6 months of expenses set aside before they need it, not after. None of this is a guarantee. Markets shift, industries change, but if there's one practical thread running through this entire divide, it's this: the biggest gap wasn't created by one dramatic choice. It was created by several boring, forgettable decisions repeated consistently over a long enough time horizon for compounding to finish the job. This pattern isn't unique to any one country either. In Canada, home price growth has outpaced wage growth even more sharply than in the U.S. in several major metro areas, producing a similar generational housing gap. In the United Kingdom, homeownership among adults under 35 has fallen by nearly half compared to a generation ago. In the Netherlands and Portugal, some of the fastest house price-to-income growth in Europe has priced out a large share of first-time buyers entirely, despite relatively strong wage growth in both countries. Globally, wealth concentration at the very top has also accelerated. Research from organizations tracking global inequality has found that the wealthiest tier of the population has captured a disproportionately large share of new wealth created over the past decade compared to the rest of the global population. The specifics differ by country. Tax policy, housing supply, immigration patterns, and local labor markets all shape the exact numbers. But the broad shape of the story, a shrinking traditional middle, a widening top, and rising costs tied to major life milestones, shows up in some form across most of the developed world. This isn't one country's story. It's a structural shift playing out simultaneously across many economies that don't otherwise have much in common. So, is there anything that actually reverses this at a policy level beyond individual decisions? Economists who study this generally point to a few real levers, though none of them are simple and all of them are genuinely contested. The most commonly cited fix is housing supply. In many high-cost metro areas, restrictive zoning laws limit how much new housing can be built, which economists across a wide range of political perspectives generally agree constrains supply and pushes prices upward faster than wages can follow. Loosening zoning to allow more housing density is one of the few policy ideas with unusually broad, though not universal, support across the ideological spectrum. Wage policy is more contested. Some economists argue that stronger wage growth at the lower and middle end of the income distribution through minimum wage increases, stronger labor bargaining power, or targeted tax credits would narrow the gap. Others argue these measures can have unintended effects on hiring or small business costs, particularly in lower-cost regions where the same wage floor lands very differently. Reasonable economists disagree here, and the honest answer is that the evidence is genuinely mixed depending on the specific policy and region studied. There's also growing discussion around retirement and healthcare cost structures, since these are two of the areas where cost growth has most consistently outpaced wage growth, independent of housing markets specifically. None of these fixes are quick, and none of them are guaranteed to fully close this gap this structural. But it's worth noting, this isn't a problem without any known levers. It's a problem where the levers are known, studied, and debated, which is a meaningfully different situation than a problem nobody understands. The Whitmans and the Alvarezes didn't create the conditions that shaped their outcomes, but somewhere between individual